Hey there, welcome to my video series on the planets through the houses and through the signs. In this video, we're going to take a look at the planet Mercury as it sails through the different houses of the zodiac. These descriptions I'm giving are mostly for a natal chart. They may be able to be applied to a transiting planet in that house as well. But every horoscope is unique, and even this information I'm giving about Mercury through the houses may or may not fit you if you have Mercury in the house I'm talking about. So, looking at Mercury in the first house, first of all, boy, oh boy, if there's anything that these people like, it is to talk. They love communication, they love to learn, and they do like the sound of their own voice generally. Sometimes the term verbal diarrhea is used for people with Mercury in the first house, and by all means, they have something to tell you at all times. Now, they can be good listeners as well, but generally they do like to speak. Because of that, Mercury in the first house can be very well used in teaching, education, in sales, and in a whole host of other jobs and situations for sure. Sometimes with an afflicted Mercury in the first house, definitely more towards the verbal diarrhea type, and they may talk about themselves a little too much. If the Mercury is well aspected in the first house, usually depending on how well aspected into which planets and which signs, it can be something that can be the focal point of their career even, or a very large part of their life. After all, everybody has to communicate, right? With Mercury through the second house, we have someone who is interested in money. The second house has a lot to do with money, sustenance, nurturing, whatever sustains us, also our early life. And with Mercury in that house, usually there is a focus on money. Being the planet of trade and commerce, Mercury in the second house is very well used for people who may work in banking, finance, insurance, and in a whole host of other jobs. Sales is another one where Mercury in the second house may be very handy, but also teaching, education, and travel. It would really depend on how the Mercury is aspected to other houses and to other planets, and of course, in which sign that Mercury may be found in. Generally, if you have Mercury in the earth signs in the second house, there's definitely an interest in working for banks, insurance companies, or with money in some way, shape, or form. Mercury in the air signs in the second house, of course, would be more inclined to want to work in education, teaching, or in sales perhaps, politics maybe, wherever good communication could be well used. With Mercury in the third house, you have it in its own house through its rulership of Gemini, and obviously Mercury in the third house can do very well there. People with Mercury in the third house tend to have a great love of education and learning as well as travel. Depending on how that Mercury may be aspected, it also may have an affiliation with vehicles, traveling. Say somebody with Mercury and Aries in the third house with a trine to Jupiter and Leo, I can guarantee if it's a male, they probably have a hot sports car because fire signs tend to like the sports cars. So you can see that especially once we move away from the sun and the moon, whatever sign the planet is in and how it's aspected does take on much more importance as to how it may be manifested. Generally, Mercury in the third house people do love to travel. They may love vehicles. They may love the whole idea of traveling no matter what the vehicle. For example, if Mercury is in a water sign and aspecting the sixth house, it could be that they travel over water for their work or for pleasure. They may just enjoy going on cruises. With Mercury in the fourth house, you have someone who loves to talk about their family and their home. And for that matter, since Mercury is also the planet of brothers and sisters and neighbors, Mercury in the fourth house may indicate having, especially with other aspects to Jupiter, a large number of friends, neighbors, and siblings. With Mercury in the fourth house, it would be unusual for that person to be an only child because that would probably indicate that they're raised with siblings. Where they stand in the family, you may not be able to tell, being oldest, youngest, or middle child, but usually with Mercury in the fourth house, that's not the sign of an only child in general. With Mercury in the fifth house, you have someone who may quite enjoy reading, writing, all forms of communication for pleasure, since the fifth house is the house of hobbies, creativity, and also love affairs. Guaranteed, Mercury in the fifth house, you need to be intellectually stimulated. Mercury in the fifth house would also be attracted to intelligent people, people of all walks of life actually, because with Mercury in the fifth house, there would be a love of learning for the sake of the love of the creativity of learning and education as well, not necessarily just for their career. Mercury in the fifth house may be writers, especially in certain signs like Taurus, Capricorn, Any of the earth signs are writer signs very often. In air signs, they may write, but more likely advertising, copy, and more short type of communications. Air signs don't have a long attention span. But Mercury in the fifth house may certainly be also very good with their hands in the way of creativity. They could be able to do all kinds of arts and crafts. They may be very handy with tools. Imagine Mercury in the fifth house, sextile Mars in the third house. That could be a male, for example, who's really good with fixing cars as a hobby. Maybe their own car, sports car, whatever. So again, depends on how that Mercury is aspected, but Mercury in the fifth house usually would be a love of learning for sure. Similar to the third house, although more likely for it to be hobby than work when the Mercury's in the fifth house. With Mercury in the sixth house, you have someone who may be very interested in providing service in their work. Mercury as an extension of the hands, Mercury rules all five senses, but in a way, Mercury rules the brain and through Gemini, the pectoral girdle, which is from fingertip to fingertip. And with Mercury in the sixth house, generally those people don't mind being of service to other people. So you may find a lot of teachers with Mercury in the sixth house, for example, educators of all kinds, could be people who are training in sales. And of course, with Mercury in the sixth house, it is a health house. You may have people who are very hands-on in healthcare. Now, this could be everything from a medical doctor or specialist all the way down to the person who just takes your blood. And I don't mean to say just, because that certainly is a very important job these days. But Mercury in the sixth house can certainly lend itself to great learning about health. And that is not necessarily allopathic medicine. It could be naturopathic as well. Again, depending on what sign Mercury is in and how it may be aspected. Mercury in the sixth house may also have an interest in the travel industry, or they may travel with their work. Mercury, being a planet of trade, commerce, travel, and education, brings those qualities to whatever house that it's in. In the sixth house, certainly the person is definitely using Mercury in their work usually. Now, to be honest, we all use Mercury probably every day in our work, no matter what we do. So, of course, it is a generalization, but again, with Mercury in the sixth house, there's much more of an inclination for communication, education, or travel, and perhaps even a service job such as healthcare, being a waiter or working in other types of service type work might also be indicated with Mercury in the sixth. With Mercury in the seventh house, usually you're going to find a person who has an interest in great communication with their partner in life for sure. With a marital partner in particular, an intellectual stimulation and communication skills would be well regarded and certainly a major point of the marriage. Now, if that Mercury is afflicted in the seventh house, oh, you can bet there's arguments, there's fights, and there's lots of disagreements, and probably more than one marriage, because communication is very key to important relationships. And in a marriage, well, it's no wonder that 50% of them end in divorce, especially because people seem to lose the ability to communicate with their spouse properly. There is also a great interest in law sometimes with Mercury in the seventh house. It is a law sign, Libra, ruling that house. It is a law house of partnerships, agreements. And you may find people with Mercury in the seventh house work within the law in one form or another. It could be everything from police work to paralegal to lawyer or judge even. Obviously, the better that Mercury is aspected and the more well placed by sign, the more likely someone would be a judge and not getting in trouble with the law, for example. And yes, that is also possible with Mercury in the seventh house, especially if it's in opposition to first house planets or in a T-square with first, 4, or 10th house planets. Yeah, that might be someone who decides that the wrong side of the law is the job that they want for themselves, or maybe a hobby, but guaranteed, with Mercury afflicted in the seventh house, breaking the law is not a good career choice. And it isn't a good career choice if it's well aspected either. You'd be better to work on the right side of the law in that case. With Mercury in the eighth house, well, the eighth house isn't a great place for a lot of planets to be ending up. And with Mercury in the eighth house, you may have someone who is very, very reserved. It may be very difficult for them to be able to talk about anything. As well, with Mercury in the eighth house, depending on how it's aspected, if it's very well aspected, it may be someone that works within the field of finance, insurance, law, again, especially dealing with financial law, sometimes legalities around joint investments, so that could be marital law as well. But Mercury in the eighth house afflicted can be pretty scary. I've seen Mercury afflicted in the 8th house in T-squares with people who were convicted of armed robbery, for example. In that case, it was Mercury in Aries in a T-square involving Mars and Uranus. And so, yes, sometimes when a planet is afflicted, the more negative qualities about the sign and the house and the planet are manifested. So with Mercury, although it deals with communications and we expect communication to be honest, obviously Mercury sometimes is the trickster of the zodiac and sometimes not so honest. So Mercury afflicted in the 8th house may be someone who could be victimized financially, sometimes by their own spouse, because the 8th house is your spouse's money and joint investments that you hold. Sometimes Mercury in the 8th house afflicted might be someone who's victimized in a business deal as well, or even through a Ponzi scheme or a bad investment. So if you have Mercury in the 8th house, you're very vulnerable to these things. You need to be very aware of this. With Mercury in the 9th house, again, a much better place for Mercury, opposite to its rulership of the 3rd house in Gemini. Mercury in the 9th house is kind of in the domain of Sagittarius in a way. And if you know any Sagittarius people, they relate well with Mercury. They often love to talk. They love to communicate. So with Mercury in the 9th house, you get a similar effect as Mercury in the 3rd, although even better. Because the 3rd house generally is what is called lower education up to and inclusive of high school. But college, trade schools, and university education is usually much more the 9th house. So once you have, or if you have Mercury in the 9th house, you generally will have someone who is much more interested in a serious education, either to prepare themselves for a career or just because they love academics so much. And yes, sometimes with Mercury in the 9th house, you get someone who is a perpetual student. They love to learn so much that they're just always taking courses. And of course, Mercury in the 9th house can be someone who is a teacher, more likely a university or college professor, especially if aspected positively, and sometimes not positively, to Saturn. But in general, Mercury in the 9th house is a higher, the 9th house is kind of a higher octave of the 3rd house, so Mercury's placement there gives it room to be a higher octave for the individual as well, and therefore Mercury in the 9th house would be someone who's very interested in philosophy, for example, and sharing their views about philosophy. Mercury in the 9th could also be someone who works in the field of ministry. 9th house being a house of religion and higher life philosophies. With Mercury there, you can bet that you've got a good orator, someone who may be good in politics or behind the pulpit, and certainly very good at inspiring other people to their point of view. With Mercury in the 10th house, beautiful place to have Mercury, especially if you are looking to work in the fields of education, travel, business, and a few others that Mercury is very well inclined to. With Mercury in the 10th house, there may be more of a leaning towards writing and communication. It could be in print or digital media, working with the media in particular with Mercury in the 10th house, or with communication being an extremely large part of their career would be indicated with Mercury in the 10th house for sure. With Mercury in the 10th as well, being so close to the midheaven, even if the Mercury is not, the 10th house is the house of fame and notoriety, and of course the 10th house cusp is the midheaven in most house systems. So Mercury being close to the midheaven or even just in the 10th house gives it a very special bright light, we'll say, in that there is opportunity for that Mercury to manifest a lot of very positive traits relating to Mercury and also the sign that it's in and the aspects to the planets. It's like any planet that ends up in the 10th house is usually a very good place for it to be. It's like the best qualities of the planet itself can be manifested there. With Mercury in the 11th house, you may have a bit of a social butterfly, similar to Mercury in the 5th, someone who may like the arts, but more likely other people's arts, charity groups. They may enjoy working in the community. Fundraising is a big factor with Mercury in the 11th house as well. You may have someone who is a very effective fundraiser, either for charity or for business. Sometimes Mercury in the 11th house may also work for government, especially if it's an administrative or service type role. Sometimes management as well, depending on how that Mercury is aspected. In general, there is a need to be about the community, to be within the community, to socialize and have associations. Mercury in the 11th house, almost guaranteed, they're a member of at least one club or association. They like the idea of group activities, of course. With Mercury in the 12th house, can be not so good, it can be very good. Again, depending on how it's aspected, always with the 8th and the 12th house in particular, that's very important to whether it will manifest positively or negatively. Each of the houses, of course, it can manifest a planetary or sign influence in both a positive and a negative way, sometimes either or. But with Mercury in the 12th house, you may have someone who may have some speech difficulties. It could be only a childhood lisp, or it could be something that is hidden. It could be that someone may have a learning disability, or are differently able about their learning, such as in dyslexia, ADD, HD. It depends, again, very much on how that Mercury is aspected and also by sign. So, for example, Mercury in an air sign or mutable sign in the 12th house, that really may cause some trouble with communications, but in other signs, maybe not so much. In fact, Mercury in the 12th house may be someone who works for the government in one way, shape, or form. Especially if it's in fixed signs, maybe they work for a branch of the government that deals with finances. So there can be a lot that can be told just by Mercury being in the houses, but certainly knowing the sign and how the planet is aspected amongst the others also gives a lot of information. I should also include that Mercury in the 12th house can indicate some health problems relating to Mercury, anywhere from fingertip to fingertip, because it rules the pectoral girdle through Gemini. And at this point, Mercury rules Virgo and the 6th house and has a lot to do with digestion through that relationship with Virgo. So some people with Mercury in the 12th house may have some hidden food intolerances or allergies, or some other such allergies as well, since the 12th house kind of contains planets and signs that are occupied there. So Mercury is not a great planet to be contained, because it's meant to be the trickster of the zodiac. It's meant to be the courier of the zodiac, the messenger of the zodiac. Mercury is all about communication, trade, and commerce. So when it's tied up in the 12th house and sometimes the 8th, it's really best if that person seek employment or a job that deals with the things that the house relates to. It may help ward off some bad luck perhaps in other areas. So there we took Mercury through all 12 houses. I hope you enjoyed that, and you'll stay put for our next video, Mercury through the signs. Thank you.